This Film is Lit, the podcast where we finally settle the score on one simple question. Is the book really better than the movie? I'm Brian, and I have a film degree, so I watch the movie, but don't read the book.
And I'm Katie. I have an English degree, so I do things the right way and read the book before we watch the movie.
So prepare to be wowed by our expertise and charm as we dissect all of your favorite film adaptations and decide if the silver screen or the written word did it better. So turn it up, settle in, and get ready for spoilers, because this film is lit.
What does a scanner see? He asked himself. I mean, really see. Into the head, down into the heart. It's a scanner darkly, and this film is lit.
What a professional intro we just received from the one Aaron Rabinowitz. Hello and welcome back to This Film is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. On this week's episode, we're talking about the 2006 film, A Scanner Darkly, based on the 1977 novel, A Scanner Darkly, by Philip K. Dick. We are joined, once again, our first ever repeat guest, by Mr. Aaron Rabinowitz. Aaron, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I want you to know, per one of my reviewers, my ability to read dramatically is at least a college theater level, which is actually 100% accurate. That is where my theater experience capped out.
I will say that I always enjoy your dramatic readings on at like the beginning and the end of Embrace the Void. So I'm a fan, but
I have no idea if they're helpful to the brand or not. But at this point, they are a deeply committed shtick that one cannot pull out of. So here we are.
Fantastic. Aaron, real quick, in case somebody, this is their first time meeting you, hearing you, what's a little bit of your background? What are your podcasts? What do you do? And why did we have you on today?
Sure. By day, I teach ethics at Rutgers. And by evening and nighttime, I record podcasts like Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space, where I use a variety of shticks to try to convince people that they should spend their time thinking about philosophical questions. And, a lot of it is mostly for my own amusement, but I'm glad that other people are along for the ride. And I'm particularly excited to be invited along on this ride because A Scanner Darkly is the best and worth endless amounts of conversation.
Fantastic. Well, we're really excited to have you. We talked about this months and months ago because we knew we wanted you back again for something, and you were like, get me back for A Scanner Darkly. And we were like, all right, done deal. Let's do it. So, fantastic. I highly endorse both Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. Both fantastic podcasts. Yeah. Big fans of both. We were on an episode where we talked about the Golden Man, I believe.
Right, I was going to say Philosophers in Space episode, The Golden Man, where you all and I, and all together, we coined the boobly that really defines Philip K. Dickness.
It does.
For a guy with Dick in his name, it's really all about the boobs.
It really is. And there's no shortage of it in this book, that's for sure.
It's awful. It really is. The hardest part of getting through his material at this point is the as one of y'all pointed out in the notes, the incel gaze has not aged well.
The book has quite a bit of a male anger towards females in this book. But
and I think y'all pointed out that in the prologue stuff that y'all did, that like this took place after the real life version of what happens in the story with like the main character Philip K. Dick stand-in having lost his wife and children, and so there is definitely a lot of animosity, it seems like, with regard towards women in this story.
Yes, there is, for sure. It doesn't. Yeah, it's interesting. We'll get to it. We have much to discuss. We do not have a Guess Who segment this week, which is our normal game show segment. There's not a lot of character descriptions in this, especially of the main characters. There are some, but they're kind of interspersed throughout the course of the book, and I couldn't find a good, like, here's a paragraph of what this person looks like. So, or a few lines. So we're going to skip that segment. Probably could have put it together, but it was a little tough. So we're going to get to our first segment. If you haven't seen or read A Scanner Darkly, Aaron is going to give us a very brief, over on Philosophers in Space, they call this the exposition zone. But on on This Film is Lit, we like to call it Let Me Sum Up.
Let me explain. No, There is too much. Let me sum up.
Yeah, so this is a story about drug use.
Yes.
At some level or another. Like we can, like the standard reading of A Scanner Darkly is it is the story of an undercover narcotics officer named Bob Arctor, whose job is to live amongst the drug users of California and, help the government crack down on really dangerous illicit behavior that is going alongside the drug trade. And so the story follows Arctor's sort of slow descent into madness as his time spent with these individuals, his time spent doing this drug that's made up for the story called Substance D, which again, this is all semi-autobiographical on Philip K. Dick, who was a speed freak, and Substance D is meant to be this kind of amalgamation of a lot of the worsts of a variety of kinds of street substances, I think. And so over the course of the story, Arctor's interactions with the government as his narc personality, Fred, come apart from his interactions with people as his normal human being Arctor self, and it ends, I guess, roughly speaking, with him collapsing into crippling drug addiction and having to be taken to a center called New Path, which is a stand-in for a lot of these drug rehab clinics, and what we ultimately find out, the big reveal of, I assume we do full spoilers here.
We can go full spoilers,
Right. The big reveal here is all of this. What Arctor was told was that this was actually about getting to his roommate Barris, who is involved with some sort of anti-government activities, maybe, as far as we know. But on top of that, what we really find out is the driving force is these individuals within the federal government, specifically Donna and this guy Mike, are interested in getting a mole into the deep insides of New Path because they believe that New Path is involved with creating and trafficking Substance D. And so they have to get somebody who's so burned out on drugs that New Path will let them into their farming facilities where they have the Substance D. And then they have to hope that that individual has enough left in them to bring back an example of the drugs plant source so they can prove this giant conspiracy theory. So that's several of the layers of this highly, unreliable narrator style story.
Yeah. After the first few chapters, I was like, I don't know what's real and what's not. And I know that's on purpose, but boy, it is wild. It's that is a very good synopsis. I don't think you missed any of the major points of what happens over the course of the film. So that's pretty much sums up the plot. If you have not seen A Scanner Darkly, we're going to talk now about a few of the specifics, and a little bit later we'll get into some of the philosophy, which is the whole reason we brought Aaron on. But first, we're going to talk about if you've seen the book if you've seen the movie or read the book and want to know what the differences are. We're going to talk about that now in What's That in the Book?
Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone.
The what?
Honestly, don't you two read?
You did technically still see the book, unless you listened to the book.
I have seen the book.
That is true. You have to see. Yeah, you could audiobook it. One Sir Thomas Smith would only have heard the book and not seen it. But, so for Katie, you got some questions here. You watched the movie. I will say, going in right now, before we get into this, that I as I was watching this movie, and now I read the book this time, if that wasn't clear for anybody listening. Normally Katie reads the book, but I did it this time because this is more of my sort of wheelhouse in terms of the genres I like to read. And as I was watching the movie, I was like, I don't know how much sense this would make if you had not read the book. I think it's a very good adaptation, and we'll get to that. But boy, it felt like one of those adaptations where it's like, man, I feel like you'd be pretty lost, but it doesn't necessarily hurt what the film's trying to do if you are lost. Like, it still, I think, works in that regard, but it is a little strange. So, Katie, you got some questions. Why don't you hit us?
I've got some questions. It was kind of a difficult movie.
Yeah.
I don't know that I was lost so much as just, kind of frustrated at different turns.
Yeah.
But I do have some questions here.
Okay.
Does the book start? So the movie opens with a guy that we don't know yet, and he's like full on tweaking, and he thinks that there are bugs crawling everywhere and like crawling out of his hair and out of his dog's fur and just all over the place. Does the book open the same way?
Exactly the same way. That is the very first chapter of the book. The only main difference here, and I thought that I had that scene in the movie nailed it for later on in the podcast. I thought that scene captured sort of the how horrifying that being in that sort of just tripped out state where you feel like bugs are everywhere, and that the actor does a great job with it. The main difference here is that character, Charles Freck, who it is in the movie, is also a character in the book, but that's not who the bugs thing happens to in the book. There's a character called Jerry Fabin, who's not in the movie at all. They basically rolled Jerry Fabin into Charles Freck in the film and gave him both of their characteristics and plot lines, essentially, which I thought was a good choice overall, because we already have quite a few characters who are interweaving plot lines in the movie to keep track of. Having another one that we don't really see much, especially because he kind of disappears in the book after he goes into rehab after the first few chapters, if I recall correctly, and we don't really ever see him again, but they kind of talk about him now and then. So they gave that to Charles Freck, and I thought it worked. But yeah, no, down to like sitting and scrubbing the dog in the shower for hours, that's all described.
I was extremely concerned for the dog.
Yes.
You thought the dog was...
For the whole movie.
Yep. That is exactly the response that my wife had as well as she was watching this with me. And I do think it is a really good move to roll those two characters together. And in the story... The narrative goes from Freck hanging out with Fabian to the main plot arc, and so there is some precedent for Freck also having this, like, picked up this psychosis from Jerry. So I think it makes perfect sense to kind of roll them together that way.
All right, so we get past that initial scene, and then we go to like a conference.
He's giving a speech in the movie. It's like the Bears Club or something. It's like a local, like in the book it's like a Friars Club or Lions. I can't remember what they call it exactly, but it's like a local men's club or something like that. Basically, I believe. Yeah.
So he's our main character.
That's Bob.
Well,
Fred in this instance, because he's undercover.
Bob,
but,
but we don't know him yet.
No, we don't know him yet.
He's there to give a speech, and the guy who's introducing him talks about his scramble suit. And then he says, "Let's hear it for the vague blur."
Yeah.
So I want to know if that's from the book.
It is. And I will say here, so much of the dialogue in this movie is pulled directly from the book, like word for word. It's maybe the most accurate to the book of any film we've ever done, where they just whole cloth pull entire scenes word for word. There's some like trimming here and there where they'll cut out some of the, trim a little bit of the fat in certain scenes. But in general, it's like word for word. A lot of the most like famous lines from the movie are directly pulled from the book. We'll talk about another one later. But so much, or let's hear it for the vague blur is one of the lines that is directly in the book. And they added a line to that guy that they didn't have in the book that I thought was funny. There's a mention to it in the book, but he says also, and so with his scramble suit, he is literally the epitome of the everyman, or whatever. And which is funny because as I was reading it, there's a line about the everyman in relation to the scramble suit. But I was like, boy, Philip K. Dick, the schlubby everyman, he wrote the ultimate schlubby everyman with the scramble suit. It literally is the ultimate incarnation.
The paragon, yeah. Let's hear it for the vague blur is probably some of the best Philip K. Dick writing out there. Like, it has that beautiful mix of like upbeat and sardonic and depressing and weird. And yeah, like if you were going to do your opening segment on surprising descriptions, you would probably have tricked someone easily by pointing out that like Bob Archer's character is described as ugly repeatedly and directly throughout the book, and is played by Keanu Reeves. Yeah, I forgot about that they do numerous times. Several characters talk about how Bob Archer is ugly. Yeah.
And yeah, he is played by Keanu
It's
Reeves,
pretty much
which,
impossible to create a Philip K. Dick movie where the main character is actually the way they're described, because they always inevitably are Arnold Schwarzenegger or Tom
Harrison
Cruise
Ford.
or Harrison Ford. Like, it's just literally every one of the best looking people in the planet play the Philip K. Dick stand-in in every movie.
Yeah.
But it's a really great line, and there is they do trim a fair bit from the book, and the other thing that gets changed a fair bit is some of the like order of events gets moved around in ways that I think are all generally good changes. Like everything about the movie I think is an improvement over the book, and then they keep these really choice lines like the vague blur.
Yeah, I disagree overall. There's a couple I will talk about later. There's a couple things I don't like what the movie did in terms of like pacing, maybe, I guess, to the narrative. Well, you kind of have to in a film, I get it, but we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
But I do like most of the changes they made in general. All right, Katie, what's your next question?
All right, so we know a little bit about our main character now. We meet a handful of other characters, one of whom is Barris, who's played by Robert Downey Jr., kind of had a hard time getting a good read on that guy.
That's the point.
But at one point, he shows up at the police station, and he is trying to turn in information about Bob Arctor while he's there.
Yeah.
He doesn't know because he's wearing
there
a scramble suit. Does that happen in the book?
Yes, that does happen. It happens much later in the book. The whole plot line where it's revealed that Barris is informing on him and he's in the office happens about 2/3 of the way through the book, if I remember correctly, in that ballpark.
Because that happens pretty...
It happens in the first 20 minutes or something.
And we know that somebody's
film.
been informing on Arctor. Yes. We just don't know that it's Barris initially. So they kind of fudge together a couple of scenes to introduce this connection early on.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, and I can just talk about it now. That's one of the things I did not like that changed necessarily. I think I know why they did it for the film. I think it helps to sort of present the dramatic irony of us knowing. I guess it's not even dramatic irony because at this point Bob Arctor also knows because he sees it. But I like in the film stewing in in the book stewing in Bob Arctor's just paranoia without knowing who it is that he, or at least without thinking he knows who it is that is like out to get him, quote unquote. I think the book just does a lot better job giving that slow burn build up of like the paranoia than like the film does, because just immediately in the film Barris is like presented as this foil to him, and it feels very sort of almost more of a traditional narrative choice than how the book does it to me. But I don't know if you disagree with that, Aaron.
No, I think that's actually a really good point. And what's brilliant about the book is part of the disorder that people experience from the use of substance D, and we can talk about the psychology side of this stuff a little bit too, is the split brain disorder where competing hemispheres like start to try to come into conflict. And in the book, the real like horror, the real cosmic horror of it is the way that Arctor in the Fred suit as the Fred persona stops recognizing himself on the screen as Bob Arctor and creates this tension between himself and Arctor that is eventually at the end replaced with the conflict with Barris. But I think you're right that the book does a much better job laying out the isolation from one's own self, and the nemesis being part of one's own self in that way, that you don't get as much in the movie.
A little bit after that, there is a scene where Arctor and Barris and Woody Harrelson's character, Luckman, okay. They're all in the car and they're on the highway, and the car's gas pedal gets stuck, and they can't slow down, so they have to turn the car off and pull it over to the side. And I thought it was a really good scene in the movie.
Just imagine tripping out of your mind and then your car won't
actually
decelerate.
My car not decelerating on the highway is like one of my biggest fears.
So it was very effective
very effective for me. Yes. Is that scene from the book?
That scene is exactly what happens in the film. There's some more to it in the movie in the book that's not in the movie. But they're on the highway. pedal gets stuck down. They start freaking out, and Luckman, I think, is the one who turns off the ignition and puts it into neutral or whatever, and they coast off to the side of the highway. And then they have that whole conversation sitting there looking at the hood, under the hood, trying to figure out what happened and how the thing got discoupled, and they're like speculating, well, somebody had to do that because it couldn't have worked itself off. And this is what I'm talking about. So in the movie, they introduce Barris, in this scene, they introduce Barris as a like, kind of a boogeyman. Like he's after Bob Arctor in the scene before this, I think. Right?
Yeah.
And then in this scene, we're like, well, probably Barris maybe did something because he's after Arctor or whatever. But in the book, during the scene, they haven't presented that at all. So in this scene, you're like, well, maybe it did just work itself out, or somebody. Like, for me, when I was reading it, and again, this being the first time I read the book, you're not sure. He's like speculating that it's Barris. He gets to the end of this scene, and he thinks Barris is like fucking with him. And did it, but then he's like accusing him. But there's also a weird thing where he like hallucinates maybe or maybe doesn't dog shit smeared all over the engine of the car. That's not in the movie, but he thinks somebody smeared dog shit all over the car. So, but yeah, the scene is in the film, but it's a little bit different.
Yeah, and there's a scene that's taken out of the book that's not in the movie about on this trip. They've gone down because, and this is all I think left out of the movie actually, is there's an underlying suspicion towards Barris from the beginning in the story, because there's this bit of science fiction-y who's-y-what's it called, I think a cephaloscope or something like that. Cephaloscope. And it's, your standard issue Philip K. Dick glowy thing for drug-addled future people to stare at. And it's it's a
lava lamp
gear.
Basically.
Yeah, it's
like
a really high-end lava lamp.
yeah, it's like a fancy lava lamp. But
and Arctur's has been damaged by someone, and like Barris has a lot of habit of like tinkering with people's shit. So like there's this feeling that Barris may have done it, but also like Arctur is expecting Barris to fix it, and so like there's a lot of like crosstalk in this story about like how much people are viewed, and so like they've gone down to try to source a backup version while his is getting replaced, and in the meantime he goes and checks in on this young woman who's a drug addict and is turning tricks. Oh yeah,
that's right.
Is in an abusive relationship with a boyfriend who's going to kill her at some point. And it's just like a really depressing trip.
It's horrible. Yeah.
That like that Arctur goes on, and then he's on his way back, and they have this near-death experience, and so like I think that adds to the sense of just being disconnected that you get in the book that is sort of tightened up in the movie for better and for worse.
Yeah, and I think I have a note about it later, but let's talk about it now, that speaking of that side trip to visit that girl that he knows who's, like you said, in this abusive relationship, I think that's one of the things that the movie missed a lot of overall, was was sort of the finer details exploring why this culture of drug abuse and poverty and stuff exists, and like kind of getting into the underbelly. Like we only ever stay with our main characters and see their world, which is adequately dark and depressing on its own. But in the book, we get these side stories here and there that really highlight like how awful and sort of in squalor most people live, and why, and sort of kind of delves into why the fact that like 30% or whatever of people are addicted to drugs and that sort of thing. There was one line in the book that I really enjoyed that didn't make it in the movie that I just wanted to mention. This is what he says to himself as he's going to visit this girl: is there seemed to be nothing that contributed more to squalor than a bunch of basalt block structures designed to lift people out of squalor.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
But, I think the book does a good job of that.
Yeah, the movie does a good job highlighting the central conspiracy concern of the story, which is the war on drugs is essentially this giant, like circular shenanigan around the like creation and proliferation of drugs within these communities to then justify the existence of this perpetual motion machine. But it lacks some of the gritty on the ground systemic like human misery that I think he really does a great job capturing in the book.
Yeah, I agree completely. I absolutely agree. But the gas pedal gets stuck and they almost die, so that's all that matters in this section.
and I think cutting the dog shit thing actually works. Like, I think...
Yeah, I agree.
It wouldn't read quite so well, but instead you get this really... And I love, like, I just can't say enough about Robert Downey Jr. and Woody Harrelson. Both individuals with drug backgrounds playing these two particular characters after having been publicly outed in those kinds of ways. Like, they own these two characters fucking perfectly. I can't imagine anybody ever playing these characters as well as they do.
No, I had a note about that later, but for me, Robert Downey Jr., I knew he was playing Barris as I was reading the book, and as I was reading in the book, I was like, well, that was perfect fucking casting, and then I watched the movie, I was like, yep, that he encapsulates that role so perfectly. It's probably the best casting. I mean, everybody does a good job, but Robert Downey Jr. is Barris in the book. It's kind of crazy.
All right, so I have another question about a specific line.
Okay.
After the car breaks down, they get a tow truck, and they're riding in the tow truck, and
it's Luckman.
Luckman says to Barris, "Are you bullshitting us or not? I feel like I can never tell with you," which was a line I really identified with. So I wanted to know if that was in the book.
It is, but it's in 70s slang. They changed, well, kind of.
Even though it's supposed to be the 90s.
Even though it's supposed to be the 90s.
The distant future.
Yeah, and he does that. There is some of that, like, quote-unquote, like, future speak in the book throughout. There's, like, a couple, like, you know, there's some slang that he kind of, to create a very specific feel for the time period of the mid-90s when he set this, 20 years in the future. But that line is exactly in the book, except instead of saying, are you bullshitting us or not, I feel like I can never tell with you, he says, are you jiving us or not? I feel like I can never tell.
Good update. I think bullshit works better.
Yeah. And Barris is that exactly that, as we mentioned, the perfect smarmy, like, faux intellect, who's, like, smart, but probably dumber than he thinks he is, but all too smart for his own good. And, like, at least it's the read I got of him through the book and again watching the movie. And just completely fucked up on too many drugs to where all the wires crisscross, like, constantly, and what once was probably a very brilliant man is turned into someone a little bit off, but
a dangerous Nietzschean sociopath, I think.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
All right, so this was a little bit later, I think.
It's like one of the next scenes.
Is it one of the next scenes?
Because it's when they're working on the car. Yeah.
Okay, so they're working on the car, and Barris and Luckman get into a fight, and they end up... We don't see them, like, actually fight with these two weapons, but they almost fight with a hammer and a big rock.
They kind of do. He hits the rock once in the movie.
He does hit the rock once, but we don't really see them, like, duke it out with the hammer and the rock, which was disappointing.
Yeah. That whole scene's in the book. Every scene in the movie, I'm fairly certain, is at least in the book in some capacity. I don't think they added anything whole cloth that I can think of, other than one we'll talk about later with Donna, but we'll talk about that later. But other than that, I think pretty much every scene from the movie has at least some close... they're like Aaron mentioned earlier, they're moved around in that order and shortened and But so this scene is in the book, but we don't see them fight. Luckman, from my memory, never picks up a rock, but they do get in a big argument, and Barris goes inside, and when he comes back out, he's carrying a hammer, and he says he just saw it, or like he just got a hammer or whatever, and then Freck shows this is where Bob Archer's talking to Freck, and Freck's freaking out. And then we follow Freck out of this scene, and so we don't see what eventually happens between Barris and Luckman. But there is the insinuation that he's going to attack him with a hammer. But we follow Freck as he pontificates on the sadness of Janis Joplin for a while. It's very, very good stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I read the, like, Barris hammer thing as, like, he's not actually going to fight him. He just, like, has it. And, the concern is earlier in the movie, we've seen Barris playing around with his gun and a silencer. Yeah. And so, like, somewhere he's going to come back out with a gun. And it is a good tension-building scene, I feel like. And what I really think I like about these sequences is apparently there's something to the fact that a lot of these tweakers in this period in time were really into futzing around with cars and stuff like that. And that this build it from the ground up kind of mentality was in fact part of that kind of culture. You just also see it being sort of confounded by the slow descent of these individuals into like drug madnesses of various sorts.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and you get a lot more of it in the book, and you get a fair amount of it in the movie. But I was amazed by how short the movie was. Only an hour and 40 minutes. I was expecting like a 2 hour 20
Yeah,
minutes.
it was pretty short.
Perfectly timed.
No, I don't think it needed to be longer, but I was surprised. It's very much. I mean, this. I feel like currently these days, this movie would easily be 2 hours.
It always
long.
surprises me when something is less than 2 hours now.
Yeah, I don't think it needed to be longer. I think it could have been longer, but I don't think it needed to be longer. But we'll talk about that more. Katie, I think you got one more question. No,
I've got a couple more questions. Okay. There's a scene not long after that where everybody is hanging out in Arctur's living room. And Arctur hallucinates that they are giant bugs.
Like the aphids from earlier.
Like the bugs from earlier. Is that in the book?
So I did some searching and I couldn't find it. And Aaron, I think you can confirm that is not. He never hallucinates them as bugs in the book.
No, nothing like that. I think that's
so. So what I think the books or what the movie's doing here is that so we don't get that particular scene in the book, but we get lots of moments where we see Bob's sort of break occurring over the course of the book, and I think in the book we get that in the form of sort of the internal monologue of what he's thinking. And different things that happen like that, and there's also this thing that happens throughout the course of the book, where as he starts to break more and more, and like literally split his brain, the hemispheres of his brain start to split, and his personality starts to split. We get these interspersed cuts in the middle of scenes of like all of a sudden we're reading like German, and it's just slapped right in the middle of like Bob Arctur's thought process, and so that to us is kind of, as you're reading the book, kind of helps put you in that mindset that things are not going like things are deteriorating. Something is happening here, and I think this is in a movie's attempt to do that kind of thing with a very striking way of doing something like that is by having him think his friends are turning into bugs. And he has this weird like what is happening to me type of moment. Was that your read on it, Aaron, or did you feel that there was something else going on?
Yeah, they're making use of the visual motif of the bugs as the way that substance D degrades your mind, which I think does work better than the German that they use in the story. The German, for folks who are curious, is actually from Goethe's Faust, and so it's, I think, meant to be sort of the way that the mind gets sort of broken down by the devil over time. You can look up the translations of the various passages that I think are sort of meant to be that kind of deal with the devil that the drug user makes. So there's a scene, and this was actually my favorite scene.
My favorite scene.
I feel weird saying it was my favorite scene in the movie because it's about Freck attempting to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And there are couple things that happen that I thought were kind of cool and interesting, but two things that I wanted to know specifically if they were from the book. In the movie, his suicide appears to be being narrated by the voice on the radio.
He turns on the radio.
Yeah, he turns on the radio and it starts narrating like what he's doing and what his thought process is. And he also wants to be found clutching a copy of The Fountainhead
by Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
Yes.
So good.
Yes, this is incredible. I laughed out loud a lot. Again, and you said it was my favorite scene in the book when I read it too. Or I don't know if it's my favorite scene. It's one of the funnier, like more interesting sort of wacky scenes in the book. That did make me laugh quite a bit. It is exactly from the book. It's not on the radio, but what the radio is doing is essentially playing us the narration we're getting in the book. So obviously we're not getting that narration in the film, but they figured out.
That's kind of a clever way to incorporate that. I like
especially because it is a guy who's tweaking out of his mind already. Anyways, turns the radio on and hears this narration of what he's doing and planning and that sort of thing. As for The Fountainhead, yes. That is exactly the book that he has chosen. I want to read this passage real quick. The whole thing, I think, kind of is great. And they miss one line from this moment in the movie that I was a little disappointed about that they didn't include. But I'm just going to... So here's the passage. It's one paragraph from the book. He spent several days deciding on the artifacts. much longer than he had spent deciding to kill himself, and approximately the same time required to get that many reds. Reds in this instance are the drugs that he's taking, the downers, basically. He would be found lying on his back, on his bed, with a copy of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, and then in parentheses, which would prove he had been a misunderstood Superman rejected by the masses, and so, in a sense, murdered by their scorn, in parentheses, and an unfinished letter to Exxon protesting the cancellation of his gas credit card. That way he would indict the system and achieve something by his death over and above what the death itself achieved. But that particular, the parenthetical there, I was so disappointed that didn't make it into the movie because it gave me quite a hearty chuckle in that moment. But yeah, I love that scene. Aaron, what are your thoughts on the suicide of Charles Freck?
Yeah, no, next to the vague blur line, that bit about the Fountainhead is some of the most brilliant writing that Philip K. Dick ever accomplished. And it is unfortunate that it didn't make it in full detail. But I do ultimately love the way they convey this in the movie. The way they convey him at the last minute deciding to not drink crappy Ripple wine and instead get a decent wine to die from. Yeah. And the last line of the story is, and they do get this in the movie. Where,
they do get it in,
yeah. So what his curse is, instead of getting downers, he got really strong hallucinogenics, and so he's stuck in a bad trip for all of like psychological eternity, listening to this multi-eyed demon read his crimes to him, like all of his sins for his entire life. And he says at the end, the joke is, at least he thinks to himself, at least I got the good wine. It's a beautifully perfect, like, a lot of Philip K. Dick's ideas are half finished, I think is the nice way to put it. And this is one where I think he really fully glimpsed through the scanner into a moment that is fully encapsulates a lot of dark science fiction irony.
I think that's the best way to put that, is when I got done reading that, and that's the end of a chapter where that ends too. And that, and it's about halfway, 2/3 of the way through the book or so. It's on page 196 where that, in my version, where that ends, and the book's 280 long. So I think that was the perfect way to put it, that it is a completely... I don't want to say... I think Philip K. Dick's a brilliant writer, but I do think you're right in that sometimes his ideas don't fully culminate in a way. Like, at least some things go places, and they're interesting and present lots of really interesting stuff. I finished this chapter, and I was like, well, that was some of the most brilliant writing I've read in a while. Like, it felt fully formed, and just... It's hilarious, but sad, and, like, thought-provoking. It's... Everything about it was just, like... I'm sure you get done writing something like that and you're like, I did it. Put a check mark next to that one. Like, done. But I thought that was brilliant.
And the actor who plays Frick, he's been in, I think maybe, if not Dazed and Confused, certain movies.
He was in
like
Dazed
that.
and Confused.
He was in Dazed and Confused. That's what
I believe so. His name's Rory Cochrane, I believe is the actor's name. He's like got a lot of bit parts and stuff, and his biggest role was like he played like a main character on CSI Miami for like 8 years or something like that.
Interesting. But yeah, he's so perfect again as like this like twitchy, drug-addled, but like has this kind of glum, accepting look as he's forced to sit here and listen to every time he masturbated in his whole life.
Yeah. It's funny though. Every time I saw him, I was like, if this movie was made a few years later, or if he hadn't been busy, I feel like that role could have been performed masterfully by Smeagol, Gollum, Andy Serkis would have done a great job in the role. Yeah. I mean, this guy crushes it. They didn't need anybody else, but he reminded me a lot of Andy Serkis when he's in Smeagol form and not quite Gollum yet, like with the lank hair and the the twitchy,
kind of twitchy and pathetic.
Yeah.
This movie has an almost kind of title drop in it.
Yep.
We're getting some
sure.
kind of monologuing from Arctur's character, and at one point he says, "If the scanner sees only darkly as I do." So was there also an almost title drop in the book?
Yes, that whole part's like verbatim from the book. That whole monologue. It's not a monologue. It's not in the movie either. We're hearing his thoughts in that moment. And yeah, the book is word for word all of that. What does a scanner see? He asked himself, really see into the head, down into the heart? Does a passive infrared scanner like they used to use, or a cube-type holo scanner like they use these days, the latest thing, see into me, into us, clearly or darkly? I hope it does, he thought, see clearly, because I can't any longer these days see into myself. I see only murk, Merc outside, Merc inside. I hope for everyone's sake the scanners do better, because, he thought, if the scanner sees only darkly, the way I myself do, then we are cursed again, and like we have been continually, and will wind up dead this way, knowing very little, and getting that little fragment wrong too. Which is exactly, I think, the whole monologue from the movie. So, yep.
Oh, it's so good.
It's so good. And that's also in the same chapter as The Suicide of Charles Freck. It goes from that to The Suicide of Charles Freck. It's like 10 of the best pages in the whole book. Like, it's like just mind-blowing. And you're like, oh, well, that was a solid 10 pages you wrote there, Mr. Dick.
Yeah,
well
like
done.
pages like 100 to 180 really drag. And then like the last 20 or 30 pages just absolutely slap.
Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a problem. But at the same time, yes, I really like this passage and I think it's aged beautifully in the world of modern data and big data, where as we've become increasingly aware from psychology that our own ability to introspect and understand inside of our own selves is less reliable than we want it to be, and we have to be more doubtful of our own understanding of our own intentions. We are at the same time also sort of cursed in this world with systems that don't really understand us, but understand us well enough to manipulate us, and whether it's the drug war or consumer culture or something, we are always being manipulated by these scanner darklies out here in the world, at the service of these systems that are far beyond our understanding or control.
Yeah, and he also feels like in that moment, in that monologue, it's aged really well in the sense that you could imagine it verbatim coming out of like a recent Dark Mirror episode, like that, but that kind of thing. But it also, speaking of like you were saying, sort of the way it kind of age or transfers to today, seeking that external validation of who you actually are. I mean, is what social media like is to a T, right? Like that's that, like, what does the scanner see? Is that hopefully it sees who I actually am, that sort of thing. You're hoping, I feel like there's some similar ideas there with kind of our reflection of how we present ourselves to social media and that sort of thing, or on social media. But.
Yeah, and on the layer of this being about drug use and counterculture, it's really a cry for help for an individual who, the best we get for what happened to Bob Arctor is he was living a safe, normal life in this house with his family and children, and then had like a jarring middle-age crisis brought about by hitting his head really hard on the corner of
a cabinet or something.
Cabinet, yeah. Right? Yeah, exactly. And so, like, what he sort of uses to justify his existence in this world is he wanted something that was more exciting than the world where there was no threats or danger kind of ever coming at him. And like, that's how he justifies, basically rejecting the model life that, 1950s America is offering in favor of the counterculture drug life of the 60s and 70s. And I think, one thing we can take away from this here, and we'll talk about it when we get to the afterword, like, I don't think Philip K. Dick is trying to defend his decisions or the decisions of Arctor as a character, but he's also trying to indict the system that came down so hard on people like this, who were really just trying to find a way through in a world that was like putting a bunch of trips on them that they didn't want to take.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely he's looking. It's an exploration of. It's he's looking to explain to all of us straights why it is people exist in this life. Like for all of us straight, for how straight as some of us are, in relation to the characters in this film. Which I don't know if they say straights in the movie. If you don't know, in the book, that's what they call people who aren't on drugs, are straights.
I don't remember them saying that in the movie.
Yeah, I don't remember if they do or not either, but numerous times
throughout
the course of the book, they refer to people who aren't on drugs.
There isn't as much discussion of straight culture versus non-straight culture in the movie.
Yeah. Is Hank actually Donna?
That's my big question.
It is a big question, and that's spoilers. That's the biggest change, probably. If it is a change, Aaron, you may disagree. But I'm pretty sure it's a change from the book.
I mean,
Hank is not. Donna's not Hank. in the book.
Well, here's what I'll say. Donna is not explicitly Hank in the book.
Yes.
I think, right, and I get in trouble on Philosophers in Space for being too generous a reader and looking for, to like fill in where I think the author could have been meaning to do something. Here's my case for why Donna is signaled as being Hank in the book. Okay.
Really? Ooh, okay.
In the final scene where Arctur they've done a bunch of tests on him, and they're like, you're super Fruity Loops. You're really over the moon on this being way too drugged out thing. The character Hank in the other suit basically immediately jumps to, why don't we see about getting Donna's help, right? Like, you're close with Donna. It is kind
of out of nowhere,
and it's really pushed on him, I think, and it's really strongly suggested that he should get Donna's help, and then immediately it jumps to him being in Donna's car, and I could totally buy that Philip K. Dick wants to give us the impression, especially because we do explicitly find out later that Donna is a federal agent.
Yeah, she's a Fed for sure. Yeah.
Right. And in this story, there's a little sequence that happens that we don't see that's shortened in the movie, where she parks along the side of the road and they smoke a little hash, and she tries to assuage her guilt for what she's done to Bob Arctur, and some cops show up during that, and she shoos them away with her federal ID. And I think this is Philip K. Dick trying to tell us that Hank has been Donna all along.
Wow.
And that that's supposed to be part of the story, that it's this is literally what she and Mike together did to him in this way. But it's debatable because she's a federal agent in the book, and Hank is supposed to, it seems be more lower down, but I think it's totally plausible. I think it's totally plausible to read it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good point. That was not a thing I got, again, on my first reading of the book. Watching the movie, and then when that's the big reveal happens, and we see Hank take off the costume and reveal that it is Donna, or take off the scramble suit, I was like, okay, I actually liked it. I had this in my better in the movie section because I think it actually works. Totally works and makes perfect sense. So in that regard, the fact that I was I like that and it makes sense means that it doesn't contradict anything. There's nothing in the book that is indicative of that being the case. And I think that's a very compelling argument you made about how Hank does immediately sort of transfer in and lean real hard into let's call Donna and get Donna to come pick you up over and over and over again, is an interesting point. And so I think you could make that argument. I think the argument could be made that in the book that it is actually.
And I prefer it in the movie where they make it explicit. I do think it's totally worthwhile in the movie to close the loop visually in that kind of way. And it may be that I'm just being overly generous to Philip K. Dick's drug-addled mind to say that he was intending that in the story.
I think it's I think you made a solid argument, though. I don't disagree that I think it could be read that way. I didn't read it that way to begin with.
I thought the way the movie did it made perfect sense to me. Yeah. Not having read the book and just watching the movie, I was that makes sense. And then especially with the reveal later that she is a federal agent, I was okay, this
setting
all
up
tracks.
Bob the whole time to get him into New Path. No, it works. I think it works really well, and so I agree that I explicitly. Having us see it, for one, just makes for a great whoa, rug out from under your moment when you're watching the movie, but also closes that plot line really well.
Growing up, my father and I used to call those gear stripper moments, and these movies were gear strippers. That's the moment where your gears really grind against each other.
You're what? Okay, it's a great moment. Last question. Well, you have more, but the last question in this segment.
Yeah, last question in this segment. Does Arctur go to a labor camp /farm?
It's a farm. It's not a labor camp. I mean, it does look kind of like labor. And I mean, essentially,
it's a
slave camp.
You could argue.
It's pretty much a slave camp.
It's a slave camp farm thing. And yes, that is exactly how the last scene of this. So the whole ending after he gets into New Path is much longer in the book. It's 20 or 30 pages in that ballpark. And we see a lot more of his experiences at New Path. And there's some stuff they cut from that in the film. But the final scene at the farm is almost exactly what we get in the book, where he's introduced to his bunk, and then he gets out in the fields and he sees the flowers, and he picks one to save it for his friends for Thanksgiving. That is all verbatim from the book. So
yeah, and it's a beautiful ending, and
it is.
You know, we can talk about incomplete Philip K. Dick material. There's a lot of it, even in this story, but I think he really does set up and then nail the dismount on this one when it comes to sort of conveying the beauty and horror of the war on drugs capitalist framework that him and a lot of his friends got caught up in.
Yes, I agree. And we'll get to that a little bit more here shortly. Katie, you got a few more questions in Lost in Adaptation, though, first.
Just show me the way to get out of here, and I'll be on my way.
Is it lost?
Yes, and I want to get unlost as soon as possible.
You're a little confused about some things.
Yeah.
These aren't things you're worried about being in the book. You're just not sure what the fuck was happening in the movie. So,
I mean, there was a fair bit of that.
Yeah.
I think I followed it overall.
Yeah, it's a very followable movie,
yeah.
But there's some stuff that could be.
But there was some stuff that I wanted cleared up.
Okay.
So Arctur is an undercover cop. He's a narc.
Yeah.
And they assign him to watch himself.
Yes.
Why do they not know? It seems really irresponsible that they would not know who his undercover persona is.
So they don't ever really go into this. There's a couple lines about it in the movie where Hank says, about not knowing who he is and that sort of thing. In the book, there's a little bit more about it. The idea is that only the really high ups in whatever this drug enforcement agency is actually know who their undercover cops are. The reason they do that, they all wear scramble suits all the time, and they do that so that nobody knows who anybody is. And the reason they do that is the idea behind it is to cut down on corruption. Basically, if none of the undercovers know who is who, they can't cut deals with different people and use their, the idea is that if nobody knows who anybody is, you can't use that for your advantage to be corrupt within the system.
I guess.
Now, that doesn't end up working out necessarily, but that's the idea behind it, at least.
But it just seems like a waste of resources to have him watch himself.
Yeah, and that's the meta point.
Yes.
What you're describing is the reasonable justification, the plausible deniability that eventually falls apart as we discover in the end when they're we totally know who you are. But the real point is the Kafka-esque feeling of the whole book, which is, this is a system where everybody is playing multiple sides and everybody is the goodie and the baddie and everybody's getting trapped in this system, and it's observing itself. And so it's again, the Scanner Darkly is it's muddied, it's looking back on itself in these dysfunctional kinds of ways. So I think it's supposed to be that kind of catch-22 feel of, this is a system that monitors itself in this deliberately irresponsible kind of way. Though as we later find out, they were never focused on Arctur. That was a pretext for focusing on Barris. So we don't actually know how much of the story that has been fed to Arctur is actually true, right? It could be that they knew all along that it was Arctur, and they knew that they could get a better response if they told him that he was the one being investigated instead of Barris.
Yeah. So it is all an artifice, but that's what I mentioned was the stated reason within the universe. But yeah, obviously it's the meta-narrative aspect of it is much more important.
And the characters in the story, as soon as you start down the rabbit holes of how much of this should be taken seriously and believed, right, you can end up wondering if you should sell your house because people have broken in and lined all of your electrical sockets with high-quality drugs, and so you have to get out of the house before you get busted with them.
Yeah, but luckily it ups the price value of your house when
it does.
That's right, because you got all those drugs there.
Except you don't know exactly which drugs they are, so it's very hard to sell it properly. So
yes, you gotta kind of estimate on that one.
So the film, I'm not really sure how to ask this question now. Okay. The doctors really kind of threw me for a loop.
Yes, that's intentional.
Because I wasn't sure how much of that was real or not.
Yep. But what you're asking about, or what you want to ask about, is that there's a scene in particular where he asks them how to get with Donna.
Yeah.
He's like very upset because they've been testing him for hours, and he's like goes on a little ramble about what the point of all this is, and he's like, maybe you guys know how to get with Donna, and one of the doctors tells him to buy flowers. But in the movie, this doctor says blue flowers, and like the camera does a thing where it focuses on her, and it makes it very like, remember this, viewer, like this is a thing. Which obviously the whole point is that the blue flowers, it's going to come back later. And I think the implication in the movie is that maybe they're like sort of like mind incepting him to remember the blue flowers. So eventually once he burns out and ends up at, like, they're part of the cogs that are working towards getting him in the new path well.
Are they cogs, or was he just hallucinating?
I think they're real, right, Aaron? Yeah, they exist.
Oh, the psychologists, I think, are real. And they don't reference the blue flower in particular, but I do think it is Philip K. Dick's intention in the story that all of the things that they want him to do once he gets to New Path are sort of seeded over the course of the story. Yeah, he does a good job with foreshadowing. So, like, they do a flowers reference, and, like, the idea is you're supposed to bring flowers to Donna, and then you'll do it down the line. But I actually like in this story how they do that little bit of surreal, straight to the camera, blue flower moment. I think that's a great change. I don't know if there's a particular time in which we want to talk about the doctors. I have lots of, I have a variety of things to rant about with regard to the doctors because I love them so much.
Let's do it right now. Let's talk about the doctors.
So what I really love about the doctors is my father's a clinical psychologist, and so I was raised on a variety of psychology stuff, including Gestalt therapy, which is a kind of psychology that is interested in the way the mind takes in a bunch of information and forms it into what they call gestalts, which are complete wholes. So, like, you get a bunch of sensory data and you see an apple, right? And it tells you the depth of the apple, how far away it is, if it looks healthy or rotten, all these kinds of features of the apple. And in this story, the psychologists who are studying the people who are on the substance D are doing a lot of experiments, some of which are directly taken from Gestalt therapy, figure background activities, where they try to figure out if the individual is able, if their mind is able to properly distinguish between the parts and the wholes in these effective kinds of ways. And in Gestalt therapy, the test for whether an entity is healthy is how flexible they are at their mind being able to create the gestalts properly given different kinds of data, given conflicting pieces of data. Things like famous experiments like the rabbit duck, where you try to flip back and forth between seeing a rabbit or seeing a duck in the same image. So you get some of the versions of that in these psychology stories, along with tests that are more conventional split brain tests, like figuring out, if the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere has been separated from the other one and what kinds of harms there are for the cognition of the individual. And I love all of that detail, even though, like, I think Philip K. Dick is like halfway barely able to understand a lot of it, and does a lot of referencing without really filling in much of any detail. But it's still very fun to see that stuff included in like part of the structure of this weird world.
And one of the things that I didn't notice reading the book so much that really struck out to me watching the movie, that I thought the movie did a really good job of, and the book references this, but speaking of the doctors, is that there are two of them. And in the book, they're constantly referred to or described to us, the reader, as the left clinician or whatever, and the right clinician. And for some reason, as I was reading, that didn't stick out to me. But upon watching the movie and the way they frame them constantly, very often we see them split between on either side of Bob's head. Yeah. On the left and the right side. Very obvious, sort of visual symbolism going on there. But they also have very distinct personalities throughout the course of their examination of him, where the right brain one is a little more, or the right clinician is a little more like personable, and the left clinician is like more of a jerk and that sort of thing. And I thought that sort of reflecting the dichotomy that he was experiencing within his own head, within the psychologists who are doing the actual testing on him, was like a clever little thing that, again, is in the book, but I didn't even really notice it until watching the movie. So it was like kudos on the movie for like making that jump off the page at me, which I thought was really cool.
Did y'all notice they use this as another example for the kind of facial aphasia that the characters develop as they succumb to substance D, where there's a moment towards the end where the female black psychologist looks like a male for a second. Yeah. It's like a black dude, and then it switches back to being the woman. So there's just a couple of like things like that they added in that I think are really quality.
Yeah, really good little details that, super cool.
In the book, do we ever find out what happened to Arctur's family, or did he even have a family in the first place?
Ooh, now we're asking the real questions. I think he did have a family. Although we do have, Hank does say you never had kids or something like that. Yeah. But my understanding is that he did, in fact, have a family. I don't know what Hank's game is there at the end. Do you know what Hank's game? Why does he say you don't or something like that?
I mean, I think what he means is you haven't had contact with those children in years, and you're playing an old script in your head that like doesn't really apply to you anymore. I do read it as like this house that they are in is the house that he and his family lived in. So rather than like he ran away from his family to do drugs, I think the impression is he drove off his family.
He drove them out, due to his drug addicts or ways and that sort of thing,
Right, as he probably succumbed to drug use after that midlife crisis with the cabinet. So, I think he probably did have a family. I think we never learn anything about them. I think this is supposed to be indicative of Philip K. Dick's personal experiences with his own family.
All right, last question, Katie, and then we'll move on.
All right. So close to the end of the movie, Arctur hooks up with a girl named Connie that we hadn't previously met.
She's indicated to be like a prostitute, essentially, in the book.
And then at one point, she's laying there asleep, and he thinks that he sees her like morph into Donna. And then he looks back, and she's Connie again. So hallucination, great. Yeah. But then later on, he's reviewing the secret video footage, and he sees it in the footage as well. Yeah. So am I to take that as an indication that this actually happened? And if it did happen, what?
I don't know. I'm going to leave this one to Aaron because at first I was... I think at first I thought it was a hallucination, and then we obviously sees the video, and then in my head I was like, well, maybe they doctored the video because it's clear that you can fake all kinds of technology stuff in this universe, because later on we find out Barris faked the phone calls between Donna and Arctur. At least I assume that, he says it, because we hear Arctur and Donna talking about buying guns or something, which is something that never happened. And so they can kind of manufacture stuff, but that wouldn't make sense as to why he would see that. If they, anyways, I don't know. Aaron, what do you got on this? What was going on there?
Well, I do think it is very generous of you to think that like Philip K. Dick, saw deep fake technology so far in advance, and that is certainly one way to interpret this. No, I mean, like, remember the person telling us that on the video it morphs back and forth between Connie and Donna is still Arctur, right? Like, we're still in the inception of this drug-addled mind. So, like, my reading of this is, and again, this is Philip K. Dick at his peak incelist. The character in the story can't get with Donna because, according to Donna, she does too much coke and so can't trust people around her body. Though I think the point we're supposed to take away is, as a federal agent, she doesn't want to get too close with drug addicts.
Well, my reading of it was less that, more of because when we find out her ultimate plan, or her role in this whole thing, she couldn't get close to him because she didn't want. She knew what she was doing to him, and the idea of like being with him while she destroyed him, that was like way too much for her to handle, was, I think, to me, part of it too, of I think
that's part of it. I just think it's also that she's a high-strung like federal agent / undercover narc, and like those are all parts of the reason that she was avoiding him. And so like he ends up sleeping with Connie as like some way to cope with not getting to sleep with Donna, and he has this visual, like you said, of seeing her as Donna, and then he sees it again when he's watching the tape in his undercover form. And I think all we're supposed to really take away from this is his visual aphasia, his inability to distinguish between faces is like transferring over into this Fred persona as well. And that that seems weird, but it's absolutely not the case that anybody probably doctored that video, and that like when he showed that video to his superiors, what they probably saw was the same Connie face the whole time, because they are not drug-addled the way that he is.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think maybe the idea of the footage also not being a reliable source doesn't play as well in the movie. As it might in the book. Like, I can see where that would work really well in the book, and you'd be like, oh, I still can't trust him. Yeah. But I think watching the movie, it feels more like you're also seeing the footage. Yeah. And not just like hearing about it through his internal monologue.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I also didn't really get the facial aphasia thing so much.
Yeah,
from the movie.
It's a little hard to gather in the movie that you're not. There's more discussed in the book about that, and sort of the fact that
I know it happens a couple times, and hearing you guys discuss it as the facial aphasia makes sense, but that wasn't how I read it watching the movie. I just read it as him kind of hallucinating.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I agree. I was going to say the same thing. I think in a movie, it's a little tougher to realize that was that we're in that unreliable narrator situation. It's obvious when they turn into bugs and then he like rubs his eyes and then they turn back into people. You're like, okay, obviously that didn't. But in this instance, when he's looking at the video, it's a little less sure. But in the book, it can read, because we know we know Bob Arctor can't be trusted in the book. So
I was thinking that maybe Donna just had a really advanced scramble suit, and that was why she didn't want to be touched.
I actually like that theory that she was Connie, and then she had a super advanced scramble suit that she looked, and it like faltered for a second, revealed actual Donna, and then it like came back on. I like that as like a weird theory, but
I think that's a generous way to read the fact that Philip K. Dick's female characters are functionally interchangeable.
Yeah, that's true. You know how they're functionally we'll talk about it later. We'll get to it. All right, that's it for Lost in Adaptation. We're going to go ahead and talk about what we liked better in the book.
You like to read?
Oh, yes. I love to read.
What do you like to read?
Everything.
All right, we've talked about a lot of this over the course, so we've talked about some of it. But there's a few things that I had notes on that I thought were things that were missing from the movie, or little scenes that I thought were really good in the book that I wish the movie had included. This first one, Donna has a discussion very early in the book about how she's like gets molested all the time, and she's like currently in several court battles suing people over the fact that they're like molesting her and stuff like that. It's very interesting, very I say interesting. It felt like a very timely conversation to be having. And I wish there had been some allusion to that in the movie. I'd say wish. I don't know if I wish it had been in the movie. But
How is that played in the book?
It's not played great.
Is that played like we're supposed to feel sorry for her, or is it played like she's a liar?
It's not played like she's a liar, I don't think. But
she's a heavily litigious woman.
Yeah, and there is a line. I will say this. She says, she's talking to, I think, Freck at this point. I can't remember who it is. I think it's Freck. She says, you want to ride where you're going? Or no, he says, you want to ride where you're going? And she says, you'll bang me in the car. And he says, no, I can't get it on right now. These last couple of weeks, it must be something they're adulterating all the stuff with, some chemical. That's a neato line, but I've heard it before. Everybody bangs me. She amended that. Tries to, anyhow. That's what it's like to be a chick. I'm suing one guy in court right now for molestation and assault. We're asking punitive damages in exchange of, or in excess of $40,000. How far did he get? Donna said, got his hand around my boob. That isn't worth $40,000, Charles Freck said. So, not ideal.
Not great.
And it's weird.
Still, yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's weird because in this story we also get the most earnest, I feel like, images into Philip K. Dick's inability to control his own fantasizing about women. There's a sequence that does get put into the movie where like Barris and Frick are having breakfast, and the waitress comes over and offers them dessert, and like Frick in the book is watching Barris have a visual representation of having sexual activities with the waitress,
like in a thought bubble.
And I think that part is plausible. Like, I think like it's important as part of all of this to notice how these characters are engaged in these activities of constantly objectifying each other. But at the same time, there is also a bit of this, like, there's a lot of, pity and concern for the few female characters in this story, the very few. But there's also not a lot of viewing of them as other than like manipulative or in some ways complicit in all of this as well.
Yep. One of the next ones that I want to talk about is the bike scene. The bike scene makes it into the movie, which I was excited about because it's an interesting scene. The reason I have it in better in the book is there's more to it in the book that I thought the movie left out that was a little disappointing, because I think it's an interesting dive into our the minds of our main characters. In the movie, we see them. He gets the bike, and they can't figure. They're like, "Oh, doesn't have enough gears. It's got in the book, it's 10 gears, and they only think it has 5 or whatever, or 6 or something. But it's the same thing. They just multiply the number of gears in the movie. At one point, Barris gets upset and goes, "Oh, those gypsies," is what he says. Must have stolen or must have lost some of the gears or something like that, because the gears don't add up to 18 in their head because they're just adding the front and the back gears. And in the book, it's actually black. He bought it from a black guy or something like that. And there's some very choice, not great language of them discussing the blacks that sold them the bike and that sort of thing. But I love the end of this scene in the book that's not in the movie. They say this in the movie. He goes, "Let's take it outside and ask the first person we see." And this felt like a nice little moment in the book, is that they do that, and then they go outside, and the first person they see is like a black kid walking down the street, and they ask him, "What's up with these gears? How many gears does this have?" And the kid walks over and goes, "It's got 10 gears, which it's supposed to have or 18, let's say, for the movie." And they're like, "What? No, it's only got blank." And he explains, "No, you got to multiply the front by the back," and so he explains this whole thing to him. But the previous scene was them talking about how black people aren't smart enough to understand how gears work, so they must have messed this all up or whatever, when the whole time they had no fucking idea how gears worked. And this kid comes over and explains it to him in like 5 seconds, and they're like, "All right, let's go smoke some dope," and then the scene ends. And it's like, I'd love that scene in the book, and I just wish all of it had made it into the movie.
Yeah, the racial element of this one is interesting, right? This of course, like all Philip K. Dick, suffers from the problems of being largely white and male-centric, but there is some bits of racial stuff going on in here. And I think one way that you could sort of view it as progressive in its own right is, generally speaking, the screw-ups in this story are the white people. Like, they're the major drug users, they're the ones engaged in all the nefarious behaviors, and that, like, for the most part, this is a tale about how, look, when the war on drugs was being perpetrated in the 80s by folks like Reagan, it was, largely targeted at people of color. But the reality was always well known that, like, white people were using drugs at the same or higher proportions. They were just in situations where they couldn't get caught as easily and, like, were protected for the most, for more so. And so I think there is some value in this being a story about how, the drug culture was really heavily driven by white people who were disillusioned by the sort of success narratives that society was trying to put on them.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was really interesting. There's the race elements are interesting. At times they feel progressive in the book, and at other times they feel deeply not progressive. It was a mixture. I was like, it's with all Philip K. Dick, it's a mixed bag, but in that kind of regard. But I thought it wasn't. That one scene in particular felt like very much a send up of sort of innate racist sentiment of the main characters. The fact that they get dunked on by this little kid, and then they're like, oh, all right.
Yeah, it's not like Lovecraft where it feels like unreconstructed racism. It feels more like self-aware social commentary racism.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk about real quick was there's a scene in the book where we get the inner thoughts of Bob as he's talking to Hank in the scramble suits, and this is lacking from the movie. He goes into great detail about how when he's wearing the scramble suit and talking to somebody else in the scramble suit, he doesn't feel anything. He talks about his relationships with Donna and Luckman, and he's like, I could tell Hank sitting across the table that Donna died, and I wouldn't feel anything. But as soon as I took the suit off and was no longer Fred the scramble suit, he would then again feel those things. And I thought that was a really interesting scene, and it almost felt like a commentary on the idea of even the people who aren't doing, like in this moment, he's not doing a drug, but the mere act of being of sort of emotionally removing himself from the situation by being an undercover cop and using the scramble suit is essentially the same as dropping a bunch of fucking death and dissociating. And it's, I don't know, I really enjoyed that passage, that scene in the book, and I wish there had been more discussion of sort of the scramble suit and what it does to the person, because I think that's a big part too of what happens with Bob's dissociation over the course of the book when he is in the scramble suit watching himself on camera and not realizing he is Fred in that moment, and then forgetting that he's Bob, and like, or not just forgetting, his brain's like, messed, all scrambled. But it is an interesting scene, and I was disappointed that it wasn't in the movie. So I don't know if you recall that scene from the book, but
yeah, I mean, for me, the scramble suits are like one of the perfect examples of Philip K. Dick style science fiction, where it's not some big fancy sci-fi change, but it's something that, besides being sort of impactful to the story, has deep mythic resonance about what it's going to mean sort of for society more broadly speaking. So the way that I really interpret the scramble suits is through the lens of the situationalist ethics that came about, especially within psychology after the Nazis, that you had things like the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram experiments, and a variety of other experiments that sort of showed that changes to individuals' environments made it very easy for them to disassociate from their humanity and act in ways that seem deeply evil or inhumane to us. And one of the major things they found was putting barriers between your face and the other person's face, and like, suits and uniforms and things like that really do make a huge difference for being able to disassociate in that way. And so to me, the scramble suit was the perfect disassociation mechanism. And so it makes great sense that in this framework, it allows for, all of these people to engage in this immoral behavior towards each other and feel totally disassociated from it until that barrier is removed.
Yeah. It's also very timely. Obviously, we have sort of, with where we are, let's date this for people in the future. It is May 31st, 2020, as we're recording this. And that, as you mentioned, I think it's a great timely commentary on with our militarized police forces in America right now, being that barrier. You obviously create that same sort of dissociation when you put a whole bunch of police officers in riot gear behind masks in a big line and that sort of thing, separate from those people in front of them. I think it reads very well, and that was one of the things that stuck out to me about that him describing that dissociation he has from his emotions in that moment. Felt like, yep, that's a problem. That's not a good thing. We don't need that. It's bad.
And I also want to associate this to another classic hypothetical within philosophy, which is the Ring of Gyges, which is basically the invisibility ring from Lord of the Rings or something like that. And this these suits to me are kind of a suit of Gaijis, where the point of the ring hypothetical is if you are relieved of accountability, if invisibility makes it so that you can no longer be held responsible for your actions, how does that change your behavior? And it seems to me that the suit creates a kind of social protection from the repercussions of one's behavior, and thereby separates oneself off from the kind of ethical frameworks that might have built up through your sense of cultural connections. So it's another way in which I think it deprives the individual inside of the suit of a kind of humanity.
Absolutely. Super fascinating. Scramble Suit was, because we mentioned in the prequel that originally he was going to set this in their current time, and it wasn't going to be like as much of a sci-fi. And I think the publisher was like, "No, make it a sci-fi," and they, which was a great choice. A little
sci-fi and a little bit of boobies.
Yeah, or a lot of boobies in the regards of the book.
A lot of boobies.
One good thing about the movie is about the book is we don't get any Alex Jones in the book. Alex Jones makes a fucking appearance, which he has been. He was also in Waking Life, which was correct. The one before this. Yeah, I don't know what it is about Linklater and Alex Jones. Is Linklater like a secret like conspiracy theorist that I'm unaware of?
I do not know why this is true that Linklater likes putting Alex Jones in his movies. In Waking Life, Alex Jones gets a fairly lengthy Alex Jonesy monologue.
Oh no!
It's
about the frogs.
It has not aged well, is what I am saying. And then I like the Alex Jones bit in this one. It's like a sequence where he gets shoved in a van by.
Yeah.
Like I don't like it because in the original I think it has a more like mundane inhumanity to it, and that feels a little bit more like in your face authoritarian state, but I don't hate having it in there. I just think it's ridiculous that it has to be Alex Jones doing it.
Yeah. There's a line that's in the book that's not in the movie that I really wish was, which is Donna has this great line. They're discussing sort of their philosophy on life, and Donna says, "We're being punished here, so if we can get off on a trip now and then, fuck it, do it." That's a very 70s line to me, very 60s, 70s line.
I want to save my commentary on that for the discussion of the afterward, because I think that's really getting at one of the anti-morals in this anti-moralist story. Yeah. One small change that I thought was interesting in the movie is that in the book, when she tells him that she wants to move up to Oregon to the mountains and live in the mountains because she's never seen snow, and they have that discussion in the movie. And in the movie, Bob asks, "Can I come with you?" And she says, "I hope so." In the movie. In the book, it's very clear. She doesn't. He says, "Can I come with you?" And he looks at her and she doesn't say anything. And he says it was very clear from her silence and the look on her face that the answer was no. And it kind of crushes him. And it's one of the things that really, this is like right before where he like truly splinters and is like completely gone. I think to me it feels like a very sort of inciting incident, and it's like the last thread that he had hanging on sort of to who Bob was and that sort of thing. And the movie making it a little more like when she says, "I hope so," I guess you can still read that as no.
A really nice no.
A really nice no. And which I guess is probably how you would read it, because she doesn't say yes. But I just thought it was interesting. I thought the crushing silence of the book in that moment was stronger to me and more powerful, and him just looking at her and knowing the answer was no versus her saying anything, I just thought was more powerful in the book. But it's a little change.
Yeah, they make Donna nicer in the movie. And the other thing that I would say is going on here is this is another bit of clear foreshadowing of where he's going to end up on the New Path farm, right? The idea of a farm next to a mountain is where she's sort of subtly pushing him towards that idea, even, knowing that like his brain is collapsing in this process.
Yeah. And then there's one more line. Donna has some of the best lines in this whole book, and she has one more at the end. I'm pretty sure this is Donna that says this. Or no, this might be Bob in his narration. I can't remember now. But the line is, "In this world, you pay for tilting with evil in cold, hard cash." Which was like, this is post-capitalist hellscape. Yes, you do. Yeah, fantastic. I have more to say about the book, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Let's go ahead and talk about what we liked more in the movie.
My life has taught me one lesson, Hugo, and not the one I thought it would. happy endings only happen in the movies.
So the scramble suit is not. I put it in better in the movie, but that's only because it's exactly what I imagined from the book. But you're actually able to see it, and it's done so beautifully and like triply in the film that I was like, that's perfect. And so I'm putting it in better in the movie because I think you couldn't do that better if you tried.
Yeah, sure. I had a note about. I thought the scramble suit was like a really cool effect.
Yeah,
and I was thinking that the rotoscoping might have especially made that. I could see that effect being hard to get without the added benefit of
the animation rotoscope style that they went for. Yeah, for sure. It's definitely helped by that. But even still, I thought it was... And one of the things I noticed, I don't know if you noticed this, is that I felt like... This is a little detail, but I felt like they hung... So while all the features were changing throughout the course of the movie, I felt like there were moments where the eyes wouldn't change quite as quick as everything else, and I think they did that intentionally because you're obviously looking into the actor's eyes, and when they're having those conversations, and even sometimes in particular, and I could be wrong about this, it looked to me like when Bob is talking, it's Keanu Reeves's eyes that we're seeing in moments, even though the rest of the features around it are changing, and I thought that was a very specific choice they were making because the eyes are so important when you're watching that performance, that if they're just completely morphing constantly all the time, it can kind of be, it can distance you and take you out of it. And I thought they rode that line really well with the effect of like not making it just like a nightmare to look at the whole time. Like I could still like emotionally connect with these characters while it was, I don't know, I thought it was great in the movie.
I think that's probably right with the eyes. And I also think that I totally agree that it only works because of the rotoscope. And I go so far as to wonder if like it wasn't true that their first reason for thinking about using the rotoscoping was how well it would work, specifically with the scramble suits, and then like they figured out that it would make a lot of sense through the rest of the book as well. But like for a proof of concept, like it would be hard to imagine a better combination of medium and like science fiction concept.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I loved about the movie is I didn't have to read Philip K. Dick's description of women over and over and over again. And if I never have to hear anyone say pert boobs ever again, it will be too soon. And I'm just glad that was not in the movie.
But what you do have to deal with at least is in the sequence where he's studying the Connie transition into Donna. For some reason, the hologram has to involve their boobs, and it's just a lot of boobs all on screen the whole time.
And they even had to have the detail of them slightly changing size and shape as it went back and forth, back and forth.
Really needed to do models of both Winona Ryder and the other lady.
Yeah, for sure. I hate the word pert. I hate it.
Do men even know how creepy it is when they describe boobs as pert or perky?
I don't know. Probably not, most of them.
That's a very, like, youthful way to describe boobs. It's creepy.
Yeah, it's an under 21 description of boobs.
Yeah.
Maybe even under 18.
Which it's not ever mentioned or alluded to in the movie, but in the book, and now this could be false, but Donna is under the age of 21. She tells Bob she is. Now, that could be a lie. She could be, we don't know. But as far as Bob knows, she's under 21 because they talk about not being able to like go buy legal drinks and stuff like that. Now, maybe that's a front as part of her undercover. I don't know. But they don't ever touch on that in the movie. And because Winona Ryder doesn't look like she's 18 years old also is part of it. So
yeah, as far as we can tell, Arctur is someone at least in his 40s who is trying to get with a girl who he thinks is under 21.
Yeah, great. Classic PKD protagonist. There's a moment in the film, it doesn't really matter, but in the movie, they make the decision when he's doing the brain test that we mentioned earlier that Bob is not in the scramble suit for that, or he's wearing it, but he doesn't have it over his face. And now, from my reading of the book, he was still in the scramble suit. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good change because obviously they don't want the psychologist to know who it is the idea, I think. I actually like the change in the movie of having him not be in it. You kind of got to just take it and be like, but wouldn't they know and be able to, like, why are they able to know? Maybe they're high enough up or whatever. But I like actually being able to see Keanu Reeves's, like, performance because those scenes are so important to his character and, like, what is happening to him that if we were watching it with the scramble suit, I don't think it would work as well. I think that's also why they realized that like we can't just have this be a morphing face while he's going through these like deep emotional realizations about the fact that his brain is breaking. Like we need him to be there.
I do agree that it's a change from the book, and I think it's for the best. And I think that in the book they tend to play a little fast and loose with these kinds of things anyway, so I don't think it's really that much of a shift.
Yeah. This is a little line that they added for the movie that I thought was hilarious. Is after the screw gets unscrewed in the engine and they're arguing about it. Luckman says, "When you're going north, it screws this way, and when you're going south, it screws the other way." And then Barris is like, "Only if you're in Australia." It felt like such a good stoner conversation to have about like, if you're driving north, obviously, man, it would only unscrew if you're driving south. We should have went north because that's their whole and that's none of that particular conversation is in the book, but I thought it was a fun ad. We mentioned this earlier, but Bob doesn't fantasize about murdering Donna when she spurns him in the movie. Well, that's in the book.
That's an improvement.
He has a whole fantasy sequence about going out to his car, getting his gun, and blowing her head off in the book, which is fun.
She does call him ugly.
She does call him ugly, so she deserves it.
Pretty hard.
Isn't it true?
What?
Isn't it true that he's ugly?
In the book, apparently it is true that he's ugly, because she's not the only one who mentions it. But
yeah, he's sort of drug-addled like the rest of them.
Yeah.
Not fancy Keanu face.
I love in the film all the close-up shots of Keanu in the scramble suit. It reminded me a lot of coincidentally Robert Downey Jr. when he's in the Iron Man suit.
Yeah.
Like it's very similar.
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know which came first, but somebody stole something from somebody there.
Yeah, it was 2000. This came out in 2006. So
Iron
I
Man,
think
the first Iron Man was 2008.
2008 was the first Iron Man. So yeah, this would have predated it by a couple of years.
Robert Downey
was
Jr.
it 06?
said
They might have both been
both.
06.
That seems a little too coincidental.
Feels a little shady because it's a really cool shot, and in this particular instance, it works really well because of how claustrophobic it is, and you're just immediately put in that moment with Keanu Reeves, and you're just like, I loved it. It's so cool. And then my final note for this was Donna is Hank. We mentioned this, but I think it's a really good change. Maybe it's not a change, supposedly, potentially, but if it is a change, it's a great change.
Well, the movie at least makes it more clear.
The obvious reveal, yes.
Does anybody have the suspension of disbelief issues with the people eating in the suits?
I thought about that several times. I was like, because it's never mentioned in the book, but in the movie we see him taking pills and drinking coffee through the suit, and I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
I don't know.
It's fancy super suit. I don't know.
I got nothing. It's just I watch it and I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
How much is this actually your face?
Yeah. All right. Got a couple things that the movie nailed, and then we're getting close to the end.
As I expected, practically perfect in every way.
We mentioned it, James Barris, our Robert Downey Jr. perfect. Just
I feel like he nailed it.
He's so good. He's so good. He's so fucking good.
Yeah.
The discussion about selling the home and the drugs being like a selling point, mentioned that earlier, but it's straight out of the book, and it made me laugh a lot in the book, and it made me laugh a lot in the movie, so I enjoyed that quite a bit. There's the scene we haven't talked about yet where Bob is watching the tapes, and he's actually watching it live, and he sees Luckman choking to death in the kitchen, and Barris doing nothing and just sitting there, and that scene is exactly ripped out of the book, and it's a really interesting scene, because it was funny watching me, as I was watching it, I'm screaming at Bob to do something, and Bob in his head is screaming at Barris to do something, and you're like, somebody fucking do something, and nobody does anything.
But and it's not entirely clear that that's happening in real time. I
is it not? I could have...
Well, I think it's understandable that you read it that way, but like, what we're told is that all of the tape viewing is happening a day or so after. So like, Bob
I could have swore there was a distinct mention. I could have thought there was a distinct mention that Bob fast forwarded to live or hit live, or maybe I'm crazy. It doesn't matter. Anyways, continue. Sorry.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I think he does fast forward at various points, but like in the original story, I think part of the joke is he's getting super worked up about something that happened like a day ago where Luckman almost dies, and like it's understandable because Barris, like once again tips his hat as a dead-eyed sociopath. But it is also kind of this comedic moment where he's watching this video and getting worked up about something that has already clearly passed because Luckman did not, in fact, die.
Yeah. See, I guess I misread that. In my head, I thought I vividly remembered him punching it too live. But I could be, maybe I was high.
They may have changed it in the movie. I could be wrong about that.
I don't remember. I'd have to go back and check the book. But either way, it's a fascinating scene. I was glad it was in the movie. I really all of the dialogue for when Hank confronts Fred about his drug problem at the end is verbatim from the book. And there's this weird juxtaposition of like where Fred for a while, Fred/Bob for a while thinks like they're gonna give him a bonus. Because he got all fucked up on the job, and they're like, no, actually, no, you're not gonna get paid. Actually, it's what's gonna happen, and it's just a very, it's a scene that's a nice indictment of what, of sort of the churning up of the people in this whole system, regardless of what side you're on. The system, this machine chews you up and spits you out, and the way it's so coldly delivered by Hank, especially because he's in a robot suit, he has like a robot voice at the time. Just everything about the details of that scene and the way it translates to the movie, I thought worked really well. But I kind of love that scene. So
yeah, and I like again the Kafkaesque feeling of, not only are you out of a job now and your brain fried, but you're not going to get any sort of hazard pay for it. I also think it's, by the way, not an accident that in a movie about the Kafkaesque nightmare of the war on drugs, there are people who physically turn into bugs. Like, that's probably also part of the reference going on there.
Yes, you're not wrong. And the last thing we want to talk about is the afterword, because I have this in the movie Nailed It because they included the afterword, and I wasn't sure if they would. Aaron, I know you're a big fan of the afterword, and you're actually going to do us. So the afterword is in the movie, but not all of it.
Yeah,
Aaron is going to do us the great favor of completing the afterword, because it is a super powerful short bit of writing at the very end of the book after you wrap up your story.
Yeah, and the stuff they use in the movie works really well, and I understand why they edit this out, but it also, personally, I want to say, in my reading through this book again this time, this has been like the third or fourth time that I've read this, I was left fairly cold by a lot of the actual story. Like, it just didn't, I knew the major beats, and the stuff in between dragged for me. And then I got to the author's note, and I read the author's note, and I just bawled. Like, I just cried and cried, thinking about the realities of all of the suffering that people survived through. So here, I'll read this, and we can talk about it a little bit. This has been a novel about some people who were punished entirely too much for what they did. They wanted to have a good time, but they were like children playing in the street. They could see one after another of them being killed, run over, maimed, destroyed, but they continued to play anyhow. We really all were very happy for a while, sitting around not toiling, but just bullshitting and playing. And it was for such a terrible brief time. And then the punishment was beyond belief. Even when we could see it, we could not believe it. For example, I was writing this, while I was writing this, I learned that the person on whom the character Jerry Fabin is based killed himself. My friend on whom I based the character Ernie Luckman died before I began the novel. For a while, I myself was one of these children playing in the street. I was, like the rest of them, trying to play instead of being grown up, and I was punished. I am on the list below, which is a list of those to whom this novel is dedicated, and what became of each. Drug misuse is not a disease, it's a decision, like the decision to step out in front of a moving car. You would call that not a disease, but an error of judgment. When a bunch of people began to do it, it is a societal error, a lifestyle. In this particular lifestyle, the motto is, be happy now because tomorrow you are dying. But the dying begins almost at once, and the happiness is a memory. It is then only a speeding up, an intensifying of the ordinary human existence. It is not different from your lifestyle. It is only faster. It all takes place in days or weeks or months instead of years. Take the cash and let the credit go, as Villon said in 1460. But that is a mistake if the cash is a penny and the credit a whole lifetime. There is no moral in this novel. It is not bourgeoisie. It does not say that they were wrong to play when they should have toiled. It just tells what the consequences were. In Greek drama, there was a beginning as a society to discover science, which means causal laws. Here in this novel, there is a nemesis, not fate, because any one of us could have chosen to stop playing in the street, but as I narrate from the deepest part of my life and heart, a dreadful nemesis for those who kept playing. I myself am not a character in this novel. I am the novel. So though was our entire nation at this time. The novel is about more people than I knew personally. Some we all read about in the newspapers. It was this sitting around with our buddies and bullshitting while making tape recordings, the bad decision of the decade, the 60s, both in and out of the establishment, and nature cracked down on us. We were forced to stop by things dreadful. If there was any sin, it was that these people wanted to keep on having a good time forever, and were punished for that. But as I say, I feel that, if so, the punishment was far too great. And I prefer to think of it only in a Greek or morally neutral way, as mere science, as deterministic impartial cause and effect. I loved them all. Here is the list to whom I dedicated my love. And then he goes on and lists the people who died, who suffered permanent psychosis, etc. And then he says, finally, in memoria, these were comrades whom I had, and there are no better. They remain in my mind, and the enemy will never be forgotten. The enemy was their mistake in playing. Let them play again in some other way. Let them be happy.
It's just crushing and beautiful and fantastic. I had a very similar experience upon reading that when I finished the book. And one of the things that they mentioned in there, which I thought was just it's a little detail, but interesting, that is not mentioned in the movie, is that Philip K. Dick is on that list. The Phil on that list that we see at the end of the movie is Philip K. Dick, who suffered, I think it's pancreatic damage, like permanent pancreatic damage or something like that. But it's, it's a just heart-wrenching and, everything about it. You understand why the whole thing's not in the movie, but it could have been, and it would have been just incredible.
Yeah. And it really, I have such sympathy for it, because I do so fully feel like I understand the dis-ease that one has with the world that we currently live in, and why people would want something that was, not being forced into the toil that our capitalist framework drags us into, and to understand the desire to engage in that, and to see the way that our society demonizes and criminalizes and victimizes drug addicts in a variety of ways for political purposes. It just seems so horribly disproportionate. So, yeah. Absolutely.
All right. That was all we had for the movie Nailed It. We got a couple odds and ends, then we'll hit the final verdict and wrap this whole thing up. All right. I got a couple notes here. I'm going to change the tone slightly. We've mentioned this numerous times, but in every single female character description in this book, the women are not wearing bras. That is the only...
Which is fine, because their breasts are so pert.
They're so pert, they don't need bras. But there's continuous descriptions of how the women are not wearing bras and how you can see their nipples through their shirts. It happens so many times throughout the course of the book. And I don't know if, Aaron, if you know who Neil Breen is. Are you aware of the person who named Neil Breen?
I don't know who that is. That's
okay. Well, you're gonna have to take a deep dive someday into Neil Breen. He's perfect for NASA. He would be perfect. He's a filmmaker.
Okay. Okay.
His name's Neil Breen. He's this very interesting fellow. But for anybody who's a fan of Good, Better, Bad, who's listening to this, in most of his movies, all of his female characters, none of them wear bras. It's like for sure a like written in part of every female character in every single one of his movies is they're not allowed to wear bras because this guy's a weird old creep. And he makes these very strange, trippy, drugged out like sci-fi films. But anyways, I highly recommend the one that would probably make the most sense for you guys would be maybe Twisted Pair. I don't know. He's made like 5 movies. Wait,
what's the one where he's cyborg Jesus?
Space Jesus. That is I Am Here Now. It's not the best one, but it's maybe the most sci-fi because he is literally Space Jesus. He comes down to Earth and he has a ram like surgically attached to his forearms, but he's Jesus. It's wild. Look up Neil Breen and take that trip.
It's a wild ride.
It's a wild ride. His movies are he's literally the like if you've heard of The Room, it's like the worst movie ever made. Neil Breen's movies are on a whole nother level. They're just beautiful. But it reminded me of how none of the characters wear bras. I was like, oh, Neil Breen must be a big PKD fan. That would make a lot of sense.
Yeah,
and I gotta talk about the Tony Amsterdam story, which is not in the movie. There's a story this is when they get to the clinic and Donna tells this story about Tony Amsterdam, I believe is his name, who saw God. And then he was never the same after that. And it's this little aside story that she's telling to Bob as he's like withdrawing, basically. I think that's when it happens in the book from my memory. But there's this description. She talks about how this Tony Amsterdam guy said that it was after that he always saw this doorway, and beyond it was where God was essentially, and this doorway led to a beach at nighttime, and there was a statue of a woman on this beach, and that was where God. There's not a lot of details. But that description stuck in my head, and I was like, what is that? That sounds like something super familiar to me, and then I realized, and it clicked into place. And it wouldn't surprise me. So, if you've seen the movie Contact, when Jodie Foster at the end of the movie, quote unquote, meets God, it is a beach at nighttime, and it's like the exact setting. And it was and that's her moment where, and she's not meeting God, like that's kind of what it is. But like, it's been a long time since I've seen that film, and we're going to do it eventually on the podcast. But and then I looked, and that is the same description that you get in the book. And I was like, I wonder if Carl Sagan read this and was like, I like that. And took a little Inspirato, took a little bit of that and decided to drop it into his. Also, doesn't really matter, but the character, the father's name who she meets on the beach is Ted Arroway, which is T.A., and Tony Amsterdam was the guy. It all adds up. That's all I'm saying.
And I think probably Philip K. Dick is cribbing a bit from Lovecraft again here, where Lovecraft often describes these alien worlds as being sort of watery and nighty as like 2 key features.
I have a huge hole in my literary background that is Lovecraft, so that's not a reference.
It's fine, it's a slog, and it's deeply racist and problematic in a variety of ways. But like the weird sci-fi stuff owes a lot to that tradition. And I also want to point out here in the Tony Amsterdam story, as I think maybe we've talked about before, Philip K. Dick, again, genuinely believed that he had been contacted by a godlike entity, and that he had a direct connection to the godhead, which he called Ubik, and... Oh. Yeah,
there's a book called Ubik.
There is a book called Ubik, and it's part of a whole series where he lays out this idea that he is in contact with a superior being. So
I was unaware of this whole side plot, this whole B plot. I missed this one.
Yeah, that's very self-autobiographical. I think Philip K. Dick's drug-addled mind, thinking that it has been contacted by either an alien or godlike being of some sort.
Yeah. There was another thing you mentioned. Katie, you posted a picture of Philip K. Dick with the woman
Tessa,
who helped him write this book, and one of the comments, and I could not see it after I saw the comment. I think it was on Instagram. Was I'd never realized Philip K. Dick was just a thin Orson Welles, and holy shit, when you see Philip K. Dick, and he looks exactly like Orson Welles. And now what I'm missing is I would have loved to see, if you've ever seen that famous Orson Welles commercial where he's like drunk off his ass trying to sell champagne or whatever. It's like a very famous. I want that, but it's Philip K. Dick. And he's like just high out of his mind trying to sell like some fucking weird thing. And that would, because man, he does look exactly like Orson Welles. It's fucking wild. Katie, you had a few notes. We talked about the dog already.
Talked about the dog. Was
you called New Path?
I wanted on record. I called New Path. The very beginning of the movie. As soon as he said New Path, I was they're supplying the drugs.
Yeah, that's the same. You get that vibe very early in the book too. They're like, "There's only one supplier, or only one manufacturer. I wonder who it could be."
Definitely not the same people who are providing the cure.
Yeah,
Definitely
no, for sure not. Nah, couldn't be.
So at this point, we have done on this podcast. We've done "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?"
Yes,
and Minority Report. And now A Scanner Darkly, and we talked about Golden Man.
Yeah.
And this has really cemented for me how much of a thing PKD has for law enforcement that becomes disillusioned with their dystopian nightmare lives.
Yeah.
Because it's like all the same story.
That's his thing. That's his wheelhouse.
He loves it. He knows it.
He does it well. He does a great job at it. So why switch it up?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that I think is wishful thinking on his part as sort of the counterculture, like hoping that like all of these people immediately want to turn on their authoritarian position. I would like to note that in the lengthy list that you just gave there, I think you've listed maybe half of the Philip K. Dick adaptations that are out there. There are a lot of Philip K. Dick movies. And most of them are not good. Like this is probably like by far the best, and then it's a fairly steep drop off from here, I think.
Yeah, you mean in terms of adaptation? Because I personally think that Blade Runner is a better film than this one, but maybe not a better adaptation.
Hard disagree. I do not like Blade Runner the movie. I like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep the book, but I think the movie
I have not read the book, so I've only seen the film. So I quite enjoy the film, specifically the original theatrical cut, I think. But I like it a lot. But that's a discussion for another day. I hated it the first time I saw it, but I will say that I don't disagree that it's overrated, but I still think it's a fantastic film.
I think all it proves is that Ridley Scott is a replicant. I think that's the takeaway from.
Yes, no, that is absolutely true. Ridley Scott is a replicant and a hack, 100%. You're not going to get me on the Ridley Scott is not a hack train because he's a fucking hack. But anyways, is that it? We got anything else?
Well, I did one thing that I think we could add to the movie Nailed It,
What?
even though I didn't read the book, which was that this movie made me feel like I was having a really bad trip.
Yeah, I think the movie even more so than the book, because I think there's a lot more connective tissue in the book than the movie has, to where, at least to me, like you're kind of going from point A to point B to point C a little better in the book than you do in the movie. Not that that's a bad thing in the film, but it definitely contributes to the feeling of just like what.
Yeah,
I feel like the only movie that does a better job than this one for conveying what it is like to have a bad trip would be Midsommar. If y'all haven't,
we haven't seen Midsommar.
Oh god,
I've heard it's great, but
super good. And if you've ever partaken in psychedelic substances of any sort, it will hit home.
Fantastic. All right, let's do it. Final verdict.
Now, are you ready for your sentence?
Sentence? But there must be a verdict first.
Sentence first, verdict afterward.
All right, I have my final verdict, and then I'm going to let Aaron give his 2 cents because I think they're going to be a little bit different. But I'm going to do mine first. As always, if you're new to this, if you're just listening in, we do a final verdict where we pick either the movie or the book. Obviously, that's an impossible choice. It's not really like, well, this is definitely better. It's just...
Yeah, a lot of times we end on a like, they're both worth.
They're both good in their own way, which in this case is particularly true, but that's enough couching. Let me get to my final verdict. I think this movie is a fantastic adaptation. I think it does one of the best jobs of capturing the feel and mood of a PKD novel from my brief experience with those. I've only read 2 or 3 and seen a couple of the movies. But in a fairly short runtime, it does a good job of making you feel like you're on a bad trip, right along with Bob Arctor. And I think the performance and the scenes the movie includes do a great job capturing the scatterbrained, unreliable narrator vibe of the book. The animation is super trippy and adds to everything the movie's trying to do. We talked about the scramble suits just being super cool, and I think the movie captures everything super pivotal that the book is going for. But ultimately, I preferred the book. The descent of Bob Arctor in the book is masterfully done, and since we have more time with him and we spend more time with Bob, we get to know his inner voice and his personality in a way that we don't get quite as much of in the movie, at least to my feeling. And I think it's really striking as we watch himself lose himself over the course of the book. I think the exploration of identity and what it means to quote unquote be someone are more effective in the written medium because we get Bob's inner thoughts and Fred's inner thoughts and that sort of disconnect between them. And I think the biggest weakness of the movie is that I don't think it captured that quite as well. I didn't, as I was watching the movie, feel like, yes, I'm seeing the weird disconnect that's happening in Bob's head, and I'm feeling the same paranoia that he is, because I got that feeling out of the book. There's also a few really small, poignant scenes in the book that were missing from the film. We talked about all those over the course of this, like the exploration of the scramble suits, making them emotionless, the depictions of poverty and the conditions of some of the minor characters. It really adds to fleshing out of the thematic explorations of drug abuse, the war on drugs, and how that war ultimately destroys both sides of the conflict. And so for those reasons, I think I preferred the book, but they are both very good. The movie is fantastic. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not far off. I think this time, as much as I appreciate in practice, like in principle, the way the book really drags you through what it's like to deal with stoners acting like stoners, I like the movie for all the ways that it adapts and tightens up the story. And so I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I would actually slightly prefer the movie over the book. I really like the book. But if I were going to try to really get somebody hooked on Philip K. Dick, I would show them Scanner Darkly before I would show them any other Philip K. Dick movie. And I think while I love A Scanner Darkly, the book, I would not hand it to them as their first attempt to try to get through some Philip K. Dick material. So I guess on that front, at least, I think it isn't the book lags a little bit. And again, I love Philip K. Dick, but he needed a polisher. Like, he needed a final edit on a lot of his stuff. And I think really good adaptations put that final edit on it. And I think this is the best version of that.
Cool. Absolutely. Fantastic. That was a rousing discussion of A Scanner Darkly. Once again, Aaron, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this episode. If you got anything to plug, now's the time to do it.
My pleasure. Again, Embrace the Void for, talking about philosophy and culture wars and existential crises, and Philosophers in Space for taking every piece of sci-fi we can get our hands on and beating it like a dead horse for every bit of philosophical amusement we can get out of it.
Fantastic. They're both great shows. Check them both out. Katie, before you tell us what's up next, I'm going to remind everybody they can support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Support us for whatever you want. You get access to different things. That's all super cool. Also, we have social media, Facebook, Goodreads, Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. You can follow us there. Katie, what's next?
Well, this time we did a film with a style that we had never done before.
Yes.
Which was rotoscoping.
Yeah.
Next, we're going to be doing a book style format that we've never done before. We're going to be talking about Blue is the Warmest Color.
Oh,
which is a graphic novel.
Yeah.
We haven't done that yet.
Fantastic. We've seen that movie years ago, but we've never read it. Or you've never read it. I've never read it either. It's a great movie. Have you seen that movie, Aaron?
I have. I enjoyed it. I don't think I ever got to read I think I got to read pieces of the graphic novel, but didn't get all the way through it. I think they were both sort of fascinating and enjoyable in their various lesbian ways.
yeah. We're looking forward to checking that out again. So you can come back in 1 week's time. We'll have a prequel episode, and in 2 weeks' time, we're talking about Blue is the Warmest Color. And until that time, guys, gals, non-binary, and everybody else,
keep reading books,
keep watching movies,
and keep being awesome.